Lawrence Neal here. Welcome back to highintensitybusiness.com. This is episode 309. And in today's episode, we're going to focus on a research paper. And the paper is Long-Term Time Course of Strength Adaptation to Minimal Dose Resistance Training, Retrospective Longitudinal Growth Modeling, that's a mouthful, of a large cohort through training records. And my guest today, who's also an author on the paper and here to help me understand the paper better, is Dr. James Still. James is Associate Professor of Sport and Exercise Science at Solent University. James, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure, Lawrence. Always
a pleasure. Great to have you. And I should say, originally, we were going to cover part 2 to Does Strength Training Improve Sports Performance, which is a podcast we did ages ago. But we both agreed that part 1 was pretty much whole and there wasn't much more to say on it. And so hence why we've just decided to move on to talking about this new paper, which is super exciting. Do you want to start off just by giving a little introduction around the paper, kind of the motivation behind doing it, maybe talk about some of the work you've been doing with Fit20 before? I'd love to just hear a bit of background.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, of course, as you said, the paper involved Fit20, and they're a fantastic company run by fantastic people, and we've had a good relationship over the last few years. And one of the nice things about their, from a research perspective, for someone like myself, a really nice thing about their model, their franchise model, is that there is standardization in terms of the way each of their franchise facilities are set up, the equipment they contain, and the protocols that they use. And kind of touching, I guess, back on one of the earlier podcasts we did, Lawrence, where we talked about the potential for using data captured out in the real world by facility owners. The nice thing about Fit20 is they do exactly that. So everything that they do is recorded and sent straight up to their cloud database. So they've instantly got access to a massive data set that we can look at in terms of understanding how people's strength develops to resistance training over time. So this paper kind of was born out of that relationship and my ability to be able to take that data and start looking at it and leveraging some of the insights out of it. We've got some other ideas for things we're going to look at in the future. So this is kind of like the first thing to come out of that data, and we've got plans for potentially adding in further data capture to look at some other measures that we might be able to start accumulating over time, and again, similarly sort of model. But yeah, this was really unique though, because when you place this study within the, and I should preface it by saying this is a preprint at the moment, so it's not, it's published as a non-peer-reviewed manuscript. So, although having said that, it has had quite a lot of praise from other colleagues and academics and researchers in the area so far. Yeah, and it is in peer review at the moment. So fingers crossed we get some positive feedback from reviewers and it gets accepted for journal publication soon. But this is a preprint published on the Sport Archive preprint server.
They're probably not used to seeing the control, right, over all the variables that Fit20 can offer like that. The data set is like just unbelievable.
Exactly. And I mean, the unique aspects of it really are certainly the length of it and the number of participants that we've got access to data on. And that has been, and we've got standardized data for over such a period of time. So it was 14. Ultimately, after we'd kind of taken the data set and cleaned it and, make sure, because there's always going to be some data entry errors potentially. So after cleaning processes, we had data.
How'd you clean it?
So normally it's, there'll be certain values which are like obviously out of range, like they're impossible values. And so a lot of I did all of the data analysis and cleaning and processing and analysis in a coding language called R. I've made the shift into analysis using that more over the last few years, because what it enables us to do is I write essentially a coding script for all of that analysis. And then I'm able to share the data and the coding script so anyone can kind of see exactly what I've done and follow through each of the steps in that coding process and hopefully pick out any errors if I've made mistakes. So there's a pressure in terms of getting it right if you're going to be sharing all of that transparently.
That's exactly how it should be, right? I love that.
Yeah. And to be fair, like absolute credit to Fit20 as well, because they were willing to make this data set open as well. So the whole data set is available. Anyone can access it and download it and take a look at that data themselves. They don't just have to kind of look at the paper. Obviously, it's a bit overwhelming to maybe get stuck into that amount of data and try to figure out how to analyze it. But
we'll leave you to that, mate.
But for other researchers as well, potentially they may think of questions that we've not thought of that could be answered with that data as well. And that's really unique, because a lot of companies do. There's a tendency for people to think like, we don't want to be sharing too much. There's kind of trade secrets in there and whatnot. But they were really forward thinking in terms of wanting to share that knowledge and try to sort of benefit the wider community regarding this. But so this essentially does represent, or as far as we're aware, it represents the biggest study of individuals participating in resistance training over the longest period of time, and engaging in a very standardized intervention with very clearly kind of operationalized outcomes in terms of what we have used to look at strength over time. And so, it all sounds very big and fancy, but really it was actually quite simple. Essentially what we did was we had the training records for all of these individuals for a range of almost up to 7 years. And essentially what we had was individual demographic data about those individuals, including sex and age. And then we had essentially their training load data. We also had their time of load as well, but we opted to look at the training data specifically because the results looked the conclusions were essentially the same when you incorporated time and load as well. And because obviously the training is done in a progressive manner such that most people will be familiar with, you'll set a repetition range or a time under load range, and you'll train with a particular load within that range, and once you are reaching failure outside of that range, then you start to progress the load. So the load progression is indicative of performance increases over time or strength increases over time. And so essentially what we're able to do is take all of this data and model how do people's loads progress over time, and use that to infer what's happening in terms of their strength over time from participating in the Fit20 training over that period.
Mm-hmm. Just quick question. Do you know how Fit20 measure, because I know, again, I love how they standardize variables as much as possible, 10-10 cadence, 4 to 6 reps, 80 to 120 seconds time under load. How do they track both reps and time under load? Do they have a special, is it on the tablet? Is it their proprietary software? Is it a special stopwatch? Like, do you know how they do that?
So this data set is from when they were kind of manually recording those things. So rep count is obviously just physically count the reps, and then the I believe on the tablets they use a stopwatch on the tablets to record time and load. But having said that, and this touches on what we're going to be looking at in the future, we deliberately cleaned this data set up to 2017. Because after 2017, they started introducing the sensor technology, which is kind of proprietary, that's been developed for implementation in their facilities to integrate with the Nautilus One resistance training equipment that they use. And so now they have sensor tech which records range of motion, time under load, repetition counts, and a number of things. And so what we're going to do is we clean that data out because it's difficult to draw comparisons when you're including that data, because one of the things they found was once you start to get more fine-tuned kind of metrics out regarding sort of the smoothness of the repetitions and things like that, people's loads were coming down a little bit so that they could focus on getting the quality right before then going back up. So we just looked at the data prior to that, and we're going to look at that data separately, and also explore some other potential ways in which we can use that sensor data for some interesting things. but yeah, so the data is, and that's hence the cleaning process, because obviously it's manually recorded and entered. So we sort of cleaned out extreme values, which were, you know, typos in terms of entering and things like that. But yeah, so I forgot. Was there another question there?
No, it's okay. No, this is good. This is good. Good kind of the way we're going about this is in the right order. Yeah, I mean, I just want to take a moment to say, you know, the standardized training elements, you know, we'll get into this probably like once a week training, single set to failure, approximately 6 exercises, you know, 6.8 years or 352 weeks of data, controlled environments, so no music, mirrors, a controlled temperature, and controlled machines, and controlled supervision. And it's like, where else can you get this data from? Like, this is the beauty of what we do. It's so much cleaner. It's so much easier to measure than alternative workout approaches and protocols that other businesses or individuals might undertake, which are almost impossible because there's so much variability, right? In terms of sets and periodization and just random protocols and all sorts. So I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to you and Fit20. And I really want to celebrate Fit20 here, because I just think it's great what they're doing in terms of standardizing the variables, but then also capturing it in the cloud so that people like you can actually use it. I mean, this is so win-win, right? It's great for you because you're learning so much. And it's great for Fit20 because it's like you can publish research, which is ultimately, well, we know is likely to support their intervention, right? So it's all good.
Exactly. Win-win.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to now go on to like just going through the paper in order. I mean, in terms of the methods, you want to talk about how you measured strength, and then we can get into some more of the methods and then into the results.
Yeah, well, I mean, it might be worth giving a little bit of context to what
Sure.
the previous sort of literature looked like in this space, because I mean, this is not only is this study interesting from, you know, the kind of HIIT community's perspective, because it's a huge study looking at you know, very low volume, high intensity of effort, you know, the usual kind of fare for that community. It's unique as well because it's a study that has looked at the time course of strength adaptation to resistance training in ways in which it has not been looked at before. So, you know, there is and we kind of contextualize the importance of the paper more in that sort of public health kind of framework, because, you know, we've spoke about this before. Resistance training does form part of the, you know, most physical activity guidelines now, and there is a kind of growing interest in it from that kind of public health perspective. And to their credit, you know, there is a recognition from that side that it should be, you know, a minimal sort of dose approach. It should be what is required to get, you know, get optimal results and nothing more, nothing less. So there is a focus on this more sort of like minimal frequency, volume, you know, sufficient intensity of effort approach for recommendations made towards public health. You know, and we've written about this for the general population and for, you know, older adults and whatnot in the past. And by and large, you know, the research supports this anyway. Any possible additional benefits from greater doses are, if they turn out to be, you know, real, are at best incredibly marginal, and for the vast majority of people have, you know, next to no relevance really.
Can I just pause you for a second? Like, I totally agree. It's you and I, and I'm sure I've spoken about this tons with James Fisher as well on the podcast and in the membership. It's like, even if they are statistically significant in terms of additional volume, and I still think from memory, the study designs aren't perfect. You've taught me, and so has James Fisher, about, you know, the meaningfulness of this. Like, okay, if it's statistically significant, is it what's the word? Is it meaningful? I don't know. In reality, like, will you actually see it on someone? Like, will you see the increase in muscle mass or what have you, or even strength? If we're looking at strength expression, and so I am sometimes baffled why. I mean, I was just looking at some of the comments on Facebook about this study, which I shared an article. What's the article called? It was called The Data Behind a Once a Week Strength Routine in OutsideOnline.com, which I'm sure you've seen.
Yeah, so that was from Alex Hutchinson.
Yeah. and they were saying, just some of the comments were saying like, oh yeah, this probably applies to, you know, the greater population and you know, public health interventions, but like, you know, is it really going to apply to athletes and bodybuilders? Like, surely you need more volume. And I'm like, I don't honestly know if, obviously there may be other benefits to that. We can discuss that. But anyway, those are just my thoughts. So please continue. Sorry, I know I kind of cut you off.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I mean, like, yeah, so we contextualize it as being important there, but what we do touch on in the discussion, you know, my PhD student, Pack is exploring minimal dose approaches to resistance training in, you know, athletic populations. I mean, he's specifically looking at powerlifters and seeing, you know, you can get surprisingly large gains from very little, even in those populations when you look at specific gains. And actually for athletic populations in particular, you know, as we discussed last time, strength itself isn't really, or we don't necessarily know if it's causally associated with sports performance. So a better approach is probably to do the least necessary to increase, you know, reduce injury risk, and spend more of that time out on the field, you know, practicing the actual skills of the sport. So, you know, as much as we don't focus on it, there are incredible benefits to a minimal effective dose approach for, you know, a wide range of populations. But yeah, I mean, when we start to look at, you know, what happens to strength over time, you know, most studies in our field are, you know, anywhere from sort of 6 to 24 weeks, maybe. When we really got stuck into the literature and tried to see, well, you know, what are the longest intervention studies that we have? There doesn't really seem to be anything that exceeds 2 years. And most of the studies that have, you know, actually implemented an intervention and followed participants up over that period of time are typically in very small samples as well, because it's hard to do those kind of studies prospectively. It's hard to sort of like recruit people and get them to take part in it, which is why, you know, although this is cross-sectional, you know, it's observational data, we're retrospectively looking back over people who are engaged in this behavior. You know, it's still incredibly valuable because it allows us to observe what happens over a longer period of time with greater ease. When you do look at when you look at the intervention studies that have, you know, sort of ranged up to 2 years, they all seem to suggest, as we probably expect, that rate of increases in strength start to slow over time. So initially people have quite rapid gains, and then there seems to be this kind of like plateauing phenomenon whereby, you know, in the later stages, there is a reduction in the sort of relative increases. And this doesn't even seem to be offset by changes in protocol or things like that, which we'll touch on in a bit more detail once we get to sort of the results and discussion, because we tried to sort of contextualize and combat some of the complaints against this, you know, our conclusions during that. But you know, those studies that have looked at strength adaptation over longer periods of time have typically been in sort of elite populations anyway. Again, many have been in small samples of, you know, rugby players, weightlifters, where they have tracked their strength data over time, and they also seem to show, you know, some plateauing of strength over time, which you sort of would expect. But there have been a few studies in the last few years that have used larger samples, not quite as large as what we've looked at, but, you know, several, you know, hundreds or thousands of individuals, where they've looked at cross-sectional records for different strength sports. So, for example, there was a study of female weightlifters that looked at how their strength, because their like strength is their performance, essentially, they've been able to track their performance and say, well, you know, does their strength, their performance increase over time? And also studies of, you know, powerlifters as well, looking at this. One of the problems with a lot of these studies, though, is they don't necessarily use the right kind of statistical modeling to properly model the relationships of between time and you know, the outcomes they're interested in, which in this case is strength. I don't want to sort of turn this into a sort of statistical tutorial, but I will. I'll send you a link actually to a really, really nice interactive kind of visualization of what the kind of modeling we used does in terms of the data. And it's a really nice kind kind of image of that. But essentially, if you imagine you've got myself and you, and we track us over time, and we have lots and lots of data points within each of us. Well, those data points are my data points, repeated data points, are not independent of one another. They're all my data points, and yours are all your data points. And so if we just plug them all into the same statistical model, we can't necessarily pretend that they're all independent. So what we need to do is we need to sort of account for the fact that I have my data points over time and you have your data points over time, and bring them together in a statistical model that takes into account that there might be variation between individuals in the way kind of strength changes over time. So the modeling we've used has kind of taken into account the fact that people can start at different strength levels, people can increase strength at greater or at faster or slower rates, and so the results we present take into account all of that individual variation and try to give a better sort of estimate of what is the general pattern of strength development over time when participating in resistance training, and in this case Fit 20 training specifically. What does it look like? Do we see truly that kind of plateau phenomenon starts to occur? And so that's what we kind of really wanted to look at. What are the sort of magnitude of changes over time? What does the shape of strength adaptation look like over time? This is a perfect data set to be able to look at that.
Yeah, and you've got some great graphs in the paper. What I'd love to do in the future is be smart enough, or find someone smarter to actually put the graphs up on the video, right, as we're talking, like some people do when they do these shows. I'm sure that's not hard to do.
Would share screen work?
Yeah, I could, but I've got so much crap up right now, and I don't trust my MacBook enough to do that. It will probably just crash. but anyway, actually, it's really easy. You just use Camtasia, don't you, and just throw it in as an image. So maybe we'll do something like that. But if not, just go to the paper, and all the graphs are in there on page 9, and they're great. And like you say, you can really break it down and look at different exercises. Strength increases at different ages and sex and all sorts. So it's really useful stuff. Yeah, I mean, just on what you were saying there about strength plateau, I remember that I like the way you put it in the paper, which is it's a robust phenomenon, right? Because you see it everywhere in all the research. And there's another paper you talk about where there were 10,000 powerlifters who saw a 12.5% gain in strength in 6 years because, it's assumed they'd been doing strength training prior to that start of that 6-year period, right? And that's just one example, but that's a big data set, right? That's a large sample size.
Yeah, so we actually did that analysis specifically for this paper as well. So again, this is the nice thing about lockdown's been interesting because we've had to think of innovative ways of doing research, and you'd be surprised there are some interesting open data sets available if you've got the skills and knowledge to be able to utilize them. I guess we can kind of loop back to the and cover any specific questions about the methods and stuff. But in general, we draw the conclusion that it seems likely that the plateauing of strength given participation in any kind of resistance training is probably a quite robust phenomenon. And by that we mean, it's going to be pretty universal. We've talked about this before. Eventually you do something for long enough, you're eventually going to kind of hit what your limit is. Probably, maybe doing different things will affect the rate of that initial gain, but eventually you'll kind of hit that ceiling, and then you'll just skirt it and try and stay as close to it as possible, as you begin to age. And so, we found this consistently. So we looked across, we used 3 key exercises as our outcomes. So chest press, pull down, leg press. And if you look across the results, there was clearly, a plateauing of strength that occurs sort of around about the 1 year-ish mark consistently across those exercises. When you look at it, and you look at the relative, we transformed the values because obviously we analyze the data based on the kilogram load values on the Nautilus One machines. But that, it's not necessarily immediately obvious to someone who doesn't have access to that machine whether or not X kilogram increase is meaningful or not. And so we convert the statistical model into or the outputs of it into a percentage gains from baseline. And so Figure 2 shows that. So you can see where 100% is their starting strength, and then how much they've increased from that. And over the first sort of year, about 30 to 50% of the strength gains are made over that period. And by the time they've got to about 6 or 7 years, it's only about 60 to 70% strength, because the gains slow incredibly over that period of time, to the extent that from sort of a year onwards, you're basically at sort of plateau maintenance sort of level. I guess one thing to just explain as well is the statistical model. We analyze the data on a log transformed. We transformed it into a log variable so that it was, for the purpose of the analysis, linear. So on the graphs, you'll see a curvy looking graph. And you'll also see a straight line on the graphs. So the straight line is because if you look at the time axis in weeks on the bottom, it's transformed into a log axis. So it's a kind of the distance between weeks changes over the scale of the axis. Whereas if you look on the left-hand side, you can see it across like time, with the same interval between each of the time points. But yeah, so one of the things we sat and thought about, like, what will be some of the potential criticisms that we've received of these, not necessarily the results, but of drawing the conclusion that a plateau in strength seems to be a fairly robust phenomena, given the modeling that we've done. And so, some people will probably argue the reason for the plateau is because they were doing the same training for that long period of time. And so it's, quote unquote, stagnation or whatever. And so what people need to do is introduce more volume or introduce variety, periodization or whatever, as they become more experienced, which is fair enough. Some people think that, and it's not actually really something that we have a clear answer on. But we do look at, what data we do have. And then, as I said, we also analyze a separate data set to try and provide a little bit of context and somewhat an answer around this. So there is at least one study that's previously looked at whether or not increasing volume in trained participants results in greater adaptation. So it's a classic study in the kind of single multiple set literature from Haas and colleagues from 2000. So it's quite old now. But what they did is they had previously trained participants perform single set resistance training for a year, and then randomized them to either continue single set training or to increase to 3 sets per exercise. And both made improvements after the year period, but they were, relatively speaking, far lower than what was seen, and has been reported across numbers of, many other studies in terms of the initial gains you get from resistance training. So they're only about, I think, maybe 10 to 12% or something. But there was no difference between, continuing with the single set training or increasing it to 3 sets. So we don't have much more in terms of experimental evidence to specifically answer that question of, given the fact that you've been doing a minimal dose, low volume training approach, does increasing your volume after that result in greater adaptations? And at least this study suggests not. So that makes us think, well, it's probably unlikely that the participants in our study from 20 would have busted that plateau if they had increased their training volume. It seems unlikely to me, and it seems physiologically implausible, really, to me as well.
Well, let me just stop you there for a second, because I had a note here where I think you said in the paper that varying the stimuli causing an improvement lacks any clear physiological rationale and empirical support. And you mentioned there you don't think it's physiologically possible. I might be misquoting you there, but can you expand on why you think it doesn't make a difference?
Well, so given, particularly for strength in particular, given what we know about the underlying mechanisms underpinning why strength as a performance outcome improves. There doesn't seem to be, we know that specifically training for the skill of performing the strength task is the best way of improving it. And when you look at the periodization literature, that seems to be an obvious explanation for why certain periodization models look like they produce greater strength gains because of the periodization. It's more because of skill proficiency in practice, training the specific skills involved with the strength test closer to when the strength test is performed. And Jeremy's group, Sam Buckner and those guys have written extensively on that. And when we've written on the topic of periodization as well, we've just questioned this idea that, it just doesn't seem realistic to think that, adaptation can continue infinitely. Well, not infinitely, but it seems unlikely that it will continue to the degree to which it seems to be portrayed that it can increase. And again, it comes back to this kind of meaningfulness thing. Maybe it can, but whether it's meaningful is another question. But yeah, so volume is one way of changing the stimulus, and it seems from what evidence we have that it's unlikely that increasing the volume specifically, helps bust that plateau. But then also the variety of the stimulus, to which we interpret as meaning the introduction of things like periodization, varying the loads, varying the volumes, varying the frequencies, etc. There seems to be, to our mind, limited evidence that really does enhance adaptations in trained persons, after an initial period of resistance training anyway. When you look at the meta-analysis evidence, both for volume and for periodization, at best, and this is saying at best with the limited studies and the quality of the studies that we have on this topic, it's tough. It's a tough thing to study. So that's not to sort of like put down the people who do this research. It's not particularly convincing to see at best trivial improvements as a result of considerably greater time investments, fancy, periodization programs, etc.
Intense mental masturbation.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, so one thing we thought of is actually we can, to some extent, one issue with this data set is that it's observational. So all we've done is been able to observe people who were doing this training over that period of time. We've not got a control group. We've not got a comparator to look at. It's not like some of the people at Fit20 do one kind of training, some do another kind of training. They all do the same thing. So we thought to ourselves, well, what could we compare it to that is at least somewhat similar in terms of the type of data we're gonna be able to draw on, and the model we can fit to see how how a different type of training might impact this. And so what we did was there is something called the Open Powerlifting data set, which is a huge data set. There's actually there's almost 500,000 powerlifters in that data set.
Oh, wow.
And what they do is it's essentially competition data for all of those lifters over time. So what we did was we took that data set and I wrote up some code and to do this, and we took a random sample of 10,000 powerlifters from that data set. And the reason for that is as much as I do have an incredibly powerful computer now, the more data you have, the longer it takes to run and fit those models. And by the time you've got 10,000 people, having 500,000 doesn't really add too much additional information to the soup. So we took those and we again cleaned the data slightly. We sort of limited to say we were just going to look at total, total squat, bench, deadlift performance. And then for us, again, that is very standardized. Every powerlifter has to do the same thing, which is essentially a 1 RM in those lifts. And we could look at the total to see, how much over time does their strength improve, given that we're measuring strength essentially as performance at a competition. We've removed anyone who failed on lifts and things like that, so that it didn't, because sometimes people go in and they might make bad selections and fail a lift, and so their total was down because they failed, all of their squat attempts or whatever. So we cleaned it up so that we had something relatively comparable. And then what we did was we fitted the same kind of statistical model to it. So we took each individual and we modeled them over time, and we kind of aggregated the results in that growth model approach. And so we were able to produce, and there's a link in the paper where the figures that we produce and the analysis we've done on that data is available in the online supplementary materials. And if people look at it, what you can see is the shape of the graph looks very similar to what we see in the Fit20 data set. The key differences are that the relative increase is far smaller. So over that sort of first year period, there's about a 12.5% increase in strength performance, whereas, like I said, it was like sort of 30 to 50% in the Fit20 individuals. Now, this is interesting because it's reasonable to make the assumption that most people who start powerlifting were probably already resistance training in general before then. Very few people just jump from nothing into powerlifting. And so we think it's fair to say that, this sample of 10,000 lifters were probably already trained. And so we would have anticipated that any gains that we saw would have been relatively small compared to what we see in the Fit20 data set. But we also would have expected, again, that if they did make any improvements, if at all, they would plateau out fairly quickly because, they're already well trained. They're already quite close to their ceiling anyway. And that's exactly what we saw. Now, the specific increase of about 12.5% that we saw, we think is fairly explainable, just purely touching back on that kind of skill element of training. So people who have maybe been resistance training prior to engaging in powerlifting, well, what they do is they shift their training towards more specifically powerlifting oriented training. And so they're going to improve their squat, bench, and deadlift performance because they're going to be practicing those specifically. But what's interesting with this is when you look at research that has surveyed powerlifters, they almost exclusively use periodization and much higher volumes, much higher frequencies, very different training styles, almost on the complete other end of the spectrum compared to what the Fit20 guys have been doing. And yet, despite that, despite the fact that apparently periodization will allow you to continue to make improvements over time, we see a sort of flat line of strength performance over time. And actually, when you touch back on the previous cross-sectional studies in powerlifters and in weightlifters, that's the case there as well. After a relatively short period of time, really, we start to see people plateau, and it becomes a game of maintenance after that period. And doing periodization or increasing volume, at least in general, results may vary on an individual basis. Maybe some people do, maybe some people don't respond to this. It's difficult to sort of decide ahead of time who that is and why. But in general, it doesn't seem as though, there is much benefit to be had from it.
Yeah, fascinating. And it just makes me think there's so much wastage and so much inefficiency and so many things that's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff that probably makes no difference, right? They could be doing other things.
So I'll counter that with one thing though, and this is where I've become way more laid back about this over time. Is fair enough. It doesn't make too much of a difference for strength, but it's also probably not negatively affecting it either. And so if they're enjoying it, if it's their hobby, if they like it doing it, then more power to them. I know a lot of powerlifters, and there's a culture, there's a kind of community to it, and you sort of take part in the rituals. There's all the memes and the fun jokes, and it's something that people enjoy that aspect of it probably as much as they do adding half a kilo onto their total.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I get that. It makes me takes me back to when I used to train at like Fitness First, 5 times a week for an hour ago, 10 years ago. This would be probably 10 years or more, with a friend of mine, and we'd go every other day, and we'd spend ages in there, and it was like it was a camaraderie thing, it was a social thing. We'd have a great laugh. So I get that. There's other benefits. So no, make a good point. One of the questions I had is, so the main result, I guess, that sticks in people's minds when they look at this study is, okay, 30 to 50% gain in strength in 1 year. And then after that, it's maintenance or marginal gains. I saw this and I thought, is that right? Because I'm sure I've heard it being said in high intensity training that new trainees will see a 100% gain in like year one or in the first couple of years. And now I'm thinking, is that like major hyperbole or a misunderstanding? Have you heard those kind of numbers being touted in our space in high intensity training before? And have you always been skeptical of that, or am I just making that up? Because I swear I've heard those kinds of percentages being thrown around in terms of strength gain.
I mean, it's not impossible. So, one of the, when you look at the relative figures in our study, we've just plotted the kind of main model values on there. But when you look at the figure one values, you see that you've got the kind of thick black line and then the grey band around it. They are what we call the 95% prediction intervals. So of the kind of data we have, we would predict that 95% of individuals' data, individual curves would kind of fall within there. But that's not to say that some people, I would need to replot it and take a look and see how that compares relatively in terms of the top and bottom of the intervals. But it may well be that actually the top of those intervals skirt the sort of 100% increases thing anyway. So yeah, and I mean I've seen it before. You get the odd person who doubles their strength in in a short period of time. But yeah, I mean in general, yeah, it's probably hypertrophy. Not everyone's making those sorts of gains. I'm sure this will annoy people, and people will come back and say like, "Oh, well, I can, you come have a workout with me. I'll show you," and blah blah blah, all this kind of stuff. And my response to that is like, "Great, do that when you've got 15,000 people's worth of data to show me."
Yeah. Okay, so just so I understand this, then, so there could be some outliers who do have a response that's like maybe 100% in gain. There could be some outliers that have that.
Yeah, and so I mean, again, I don't want to sort of get too stuck into the nitty gritty of the statistics. Part of the reason for making the figures is because actually you can quite easily understand what the results show without having to get stuck into like the model summary tables where we have all of the what the coefficient weights and stuff are and what the random effects variances are and things like that. But the part of the reason for using the kind of model we use is that it takes into account that yes, people can start at very different strength levels and people can increase and increase their strength to varying degrees, and so there is variation in both of those parameters in the model, and so I mean there is quite substantial variation between individuals, but in general, like the growth looks like increase starts to plateau out.
Yeah. So let's just let me map this against you, right? How long have you been strength training for?
Oh, that's a great question. Probably since I was 14.
And you're what? What are you now? 30?
32.
32. Okay. See, I was generous. So when do you know when an adult male basically reaches their baseline untrained peak? Is it like 21 or 25 or what is that? Do you know that? Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I mean it's around about the sort of mid-20s period really that you see people peak in strength, and
just naturally, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so anticipating, like I know where your question's kind of leading, and this is quite interesting because one of the papers that we looked at and discussed in the introduction that looked at a fairly large sample of weightlifters, just shy of 4,000 weightlifters, and they actually tracked. This was cross-sectional, so it wasn't tracking individuals over time, but they looked at how weightlifting performance differed from between 14 to 30 years of age. And you see quite clearly that essentially performance peaks in around the mid-20s, and then after that, it's sort of maintained for a bit and starts to decline, given sort of like age and whatnot. But yeah, it's so I would. most of my gains were probably age related, starting so early. So it's hard to tease out what is what's intervention and what's not. Actually, this is a problem with developmental research in pediatric exercises. You always have to have a control group to see what happens just as they grow, right? As opposed to what happens when they're growing and you give them an intervention.
Oh yeah, and that's obviously if you've got someone who's very genetically gifted, you can see, at least in my experience, you can see tremendous gains right across those early years when they combine just their natural growth with resistance training, right? Mm-hmm. So going back to what we were saying, it's like you hit 25. At 25, you're doing strength training. Maybe you're doing high intensity training, but you're doing strength training, right? Pretty regularly. So by 26, you've pretty much plateaued, right? Or 27, if you assume that maybe you're messing around a lot in that first year, not really, just making some assumptions just for like, being conservative. So then by 27, you've peaked, right? And then after that, it's just maintenance or marginal gains. Would that be accurate?
I mean, yeah, it's depressing, but I would say so, yeah. Again, I would caveat, like, that's not to say you can't improve performance still, but it very much gets to the point where, you could question the meaningfulness of the changes that you're producing. And like if before that we sat you down, Lawrence, and said, okay, what's the smallest change in strength that would mean something to you, that you would care about? And we got you to commit to that. Like, I'm pretty certain that after, the first year or two, it would get to the point where any changes you see are not exceeding what you said ahead of time really mattered to you. And if we held you to that, you'd have to sort of conclude, like, yeah, I'm pretty much at maintenance. this is I'm as much as you want to sort of like say, yes, I've added a few seconds time under load to my leg press. It's sort of like, it's maintenance.
Got it. Yeah. I just, I'm trying to sort of reconcile this from things I've heard from our colleagues and, claims that clients, I guess we are talking about strength here. And obviously there are lots of other potential benefits to more volume or more frequency. And maybe it's a good time for me to talk to you about this. If you look at what we're talking about here, once a week, 6 or 7 exercises, single set to failure, it got me thinking, okay, why would you do twice a week? If you assume that, maybe we can come on to hypertrophy in a moment, but if you assume that strength is going to be pretty much taken care of once a week, and for the most part, well, maybe twice a week gets you there faster. Twice a week perhaps has metabolic benefits, elevating metabolism for 3 days or whatever. Maybe there's more hypertrophy from additional volume. Maybe it improves specific skills in other exercises, right? It gives you more opportunity to work on other exercises just for your own personal enjoyment. And then, the last thing I wrote is fun in quotations. I put it in quotations because I don't know. I like training, but I usually like anticipating training. I like the feeling after training. I don't normally like training.
They call it the dentist effect. I've had so many people say, like, training is like when I used to train people a lot, more than one person said it's like going to the dentist. Like you kind of you hate it when you're there. Like, it's not a fun experience, but I know what you mean. I understand what you mean, but I'm one of those weirdos who does like it.
Yeah, well, we know you're a masochist. You're a very public masochist. So
I think that's called an exhibitionist.
An exhibitionist, yeah. So what? So that was a kind of a question in there. Would that be a rationale or a group of rationales for twice a week? Do you think? And what do you think?
Yeah, so I think,
or more, obviously.
Look, the way I look at it is, if if we take this data in context, if your goal is to, optimize strength over, and you want to engage in a behavior long term to do that, then you don't need to do more than this. I would, is likely the case. But as you say, there may be other benefits to doing that. That also doesn't necessarily mean, so thinking about this in context for, Fit 20, their model is once a week, so they're not going to be increasing it to twice a week. But that's not to say, their clients don't go engage in other activities outside of this. And in fact, it's encouraged. It's part of the thing. And maybe one of those activities is they want to do a little bit of extra training at home or something like that. But I guess it's somewhat combating people laboring under the illusion that they're still searching for that magic bullet, that like I want to bust that plateau and things like that, and just coming to terms with the fact that like, look, this is likely a very robust physiological phenomenon. I mean, we see it in Fit 20's clients, we see it in power lifters. I've got another data set which I'm hopefully going to be able to finish up analyzing and working on as well, looking at a few different kinds of resistance training, which I can't talk too much about at the moment because I need to sort of confirm whether I'm going to be able to do that, because it's another commercial data set. But it's looking very similar. There's still that kind of plateau phenomenon that occurs after sort of a year or so. I'd love to as well. I'm going to hopefully find some time.
Is that related to hypertrophy, did you say, or is that something else?
No, this is looking at strength again as well. But one of the things we're going to be exploring with Fit 20 what other outcomes we can capture over time. And although it's difficult to capture hypertrophy measurements over time without, the right sort of equipment to do so, we have been talking about wider things to capture, things like, mental health and well-being outcomes, simple kind of, questionnaire items that could be captured, surveys that could be done at regular intervals with their clients. So we can see like, when people start training, how does their mental health improve? How does their quality of life improve? So we can start to map some of these more softer outcomes, but things that actually for the vast majority of people are way more important, totally. Way more meaningful for them.
That stuff's going to be so good for the high intensity studios. Being able to talk about that research with clients is going to be really helpful.
Yeah. And one thing I think, coming back to this kind of like robustness of this phenomenon, I think it's just it's reality. That's physiologically what happens in terms of adaptation, in terms of the human body, in terms of performance and things like that. Like there's rapid adaptation, relatively speaking, and then there's a plateauing out of it. It eventually hits its kind of like rate limiting part and doesn't go any further. And
you're referring to hypertrophy there, or?
I would imagine the growth model looks pretty much exactly the same, if not slightly leftward shifted. I would imagine. I'm one of those cynics who thinks that the vast majority of gains you get are very short term hypertrophy wise, and everything after that is pretty much maintenance.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think Jeremy's group they published a nice review a few years back looking at time course of muscular hypertrophy adaptations, again showing the vast majority happen within the first 12 weeks of the intervention data that we have. So I would anticipate it looking similar. If we had an equivalent data set like this with
that's crazy. I remember that paper, but I remember. I remember the paper, but I don't remember the details of the paper. Was it 12 weeks? Most people see most of what they'll get in terms of muscle in 12 weeks. Are you sure? Wow. That's insane. That's 3 months. How depressing.
Yeah, I know. I tend to think everything after that people interpret as aesthetic improvement are more related to other changes in body composition that just make you look better. And then people think, I'm gaining... It's because I gained fat, right? Yeah. Or lighting.
Lighting's very powerful.
Learning how to take good photos.
Yeah. I miss gym lighting, actually. I just want to say, I know people, we are probably upsetting a lot of people right now, James, but that's okay. People might be hearing me say this and they might be thinking, is he just training once a week, big 5 or 6 exercises? I'm actually training in January. I trained 11 times, right? Which is a lot for me. And I have an ABC routine. Each routine is like 10 to 12 exercises. And 2 of them are in the studio on machines, MedX, and 1 of them is like home base, like chin-ups and stuff. There's quite a lot of volume. I mean, sometimes it's usually twice a week, occasionally 3 times a week. But I'm also at the same time, I'm aware that like it might not make much difference at all to do more. But I'm always keen to experiment. And I think the value in these conversations and in the research you do is always challenging what we think is true, right? That's the whole point of science, right? Always searching for an explanation, always there's never it's never completely conclusive, right? That's the whole point of it. And on that note, I want to ask you something that is completely not related to this study, but about science in general, because I was fascinated by this, and I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about it. So I'm trying to understand, I guess, the scientific method better. And I was listening to Naval Ravikant, who's like a famous investor, a really smart guy, and I really enjoy listening to his stuff online. And he had this conversation with this like quantum physicist guy, super smart guy. And they were talking about science and what does science mean, and how it's not actually science when people say science shows this, or like people talk about science like it's the answer, it's definitive, we're done, we're dogmatic, there's nothing more on this particular subject, right? And science should always be challenging things. And one of the things they talked about is it's not, and this is, I'm not sure, hopefully I get this right, and I might word this completely wrong. It's not scientific to say, okay, well, all the evidence supports this, therefore, like, this is the answer because of black swans, right? Because it's like you can have all this evidence to support that all swans are white, and then suddenly you find a black swan and it undoes all. Maybe I'm explaining this really badly, but they were trying to make the case that mounting evidence is not necessarily like the most, like, I don't know, productive way to look at science. It's more about trying to find a clearer explanation for why things are the way they are, or why reality is. I'm not sure if that made any sense, but do you know where I'm going with that? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and do you know what? This is interesting actually, because I've spent a lot of time over the last few years. I in my early sort of like training, I spent a lot. I mean, what you're referring to is essentially falsificationism. Yeah, it's Karl Popper's kind of,
that's it.
Approach to science, which is to say that you can't really sort of generate knowledge inductively, for exactly that reason. You say that there's always the possibility that the next day you'll observe something that falsifies your theory. So the idea is that we kind of generate theories and ideas, and from that we generate predictions, and then we figure out ways of testing those, and we try and edge closer and closer to a theory which has a high verisimilitude or truthiness, the thing that we think is closest to the truth, because we keep on testing it, we keep on pushing it, we keep on kicking the shit out of it and seeing whether or not we can find a way of falsifying it. And eventually we get to the point where we sort of think to ourselves like, well, we've thrown everything we can think of at this idea, and it still seems to survive. But and truly survive. I don't mean in terms of like it's just widely accepted. Like it survived in terms of we've made these predictions, and if these predictions don't bear out, then that means there's something wrong with the theory. It's a case of like we keep making these predictions, and every time we find exactly what the theory says we should find. That's also only one approach to science. Like there's actually there's more to philosophy of science and the differing kinds of epistemologies that logically kind of make sense and also practically actually happen out in the real world of where science is, the rubber meets the road and people do it. I would actually recommend something. I'm going to recommend a couple of courses actually, which are I recommend to all my students, and I think are really nice because they're free. But I think they're also presented in a way that are understandable to people who aren't scientists as well, and are useful. So a guy I know, a friend of mine, Daniel Larkins, who is a psychologist at Eindhoven in the Netherlands. He's put two really nice courses together on Coursera. They're both free. One is called Improving Your Statistical Inferences, and one is Improving Your Statistical Questions. And they sound like they're going to be purely about statistics, but they're not. They're more broadly about, what are we trying to do with research and science? What are the kind of different perspectives that you can take in terms of your approach to trying to draw inferences about the world, and trying to come up with questions that can be answered via different approaches to collecting data and observations. And how do you draw inferences, how do you kind of extrapolate ideas out? And they're just very nice kind of course that I think would be worthwhile for a lot of people to sort of take. And you can just watch the videos for free on Coursera if you like.
Yeah, thank you. We'll link that up for sure. And thanks for also, I'm glad you knew what I was talking about. You brought up Karl Popper, and made sense of what I was saying, because I just thought I was going nowhere with that.
Another great book, actually. And again, it's a nice small. Oh no, I don't have it on my shelf because I've lent it to someone, and that was before COVID, so I haven't had the chance to get it back yet.
That's gone now, mate. That's gone.
Yeah, there's a nice book. It's only like, I don't know, it's only like 130 pages or something. Called An Introduction to Psychology as a Science, by Zoltan Dieners, and it's as much as it's marketed as an introduction to psychology as a science, and it's written by a psychologist. There's a story behind that. I've heard that the publisher said if we label it as Introduction to Psychology as a Science, then it will sell more copies because there are more psychology undergraduates than most other places. So, but it gives a very nice, broad, general introduction to philosophy of science, the differing kind of perspectives on that. Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, Lakatos. The philosophy of science is still something that's being discussed now, and there's still advancements and development. Well, I say advancements. People are still debating ideas of, what are the philosophers still talk about, what are the right ways to kind of generate knowledge, and how do we know whether something has, truthiness to it and things. So, they're all important things that even scientists themselves don't take the time to really care about sufficiently, and use to sort of like try and inform the work that they're doing.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So sorry, I took us way off base with that, but I had it down. I thought if I get time, I'll ask him this. All right. So I just want to ask you, and I know I keep bringing it up. I think on Instagram a while ago, we were talking about obviously the paper we've just discussed, and you were hinting at it, and I was getting all excited. And and you mentioned, obviously, you kind of joked about how depressing it is. and then we talked about hypertrophy in the same breath, and you said, yeah, that's probably even more depressing. Is there maybe you've already answered this, but is there any stuff in the works to try and look at a same kind of data set, same scale for muscle hypertrophy or something like that?
So we've not got anything in the works, but it's something that would be really nice to collect some data on at some point. Like I said, though, it's tough because I think to collect data at this scale would,
you need muscle biopsy and stuff like that, right?
Well, not even that. No, I mean,
okay.
you probably. I mean, ultimately, you can probably get away. You can probably get away with circumference measurements over time, and given a sufficient sample size and maybe tracking of other aspects of body composition, that would probably be fine. I mean, circumference measurements are pretty well correlated with ultrasound muscle thickness, and the changes in ultrasound muscle thickness are pretty well correlated with the changes in limb circumferences as well. So, you could probably draw a quite broad general conclusion that was pretty accurate if you collected that data over time. But you know what people are like. People will go, circumference isn't scientific, because they think that sexy measures means things are scientific. But the barrier to it is, at the lower cost end, probably ultrasound is the most feasible way of doing it. But an ultrasound costs 10 grand or up, and so for most facilities that's not a worthwhile investment just to collect sufficient data that one day I might be able to come in and do some growth modeling on it and tell you the depressing story that hypertrophy plateaus pretty early. And I
just can't believe 12 weeks. I just can't believe that. Like I need to see more evidence to support that, to believe that. I just think that's absolutely crazy. That just, I'm sure that's going to drive the listeners mad. Maybe some people are already aware of that. What was a final thing I was going to ask you? Oh yeah, I mean, again, I want to kind of make the point here that, you know, even though we're talking about a real minimalist training, minimum effective dose, you know, I'm training a fair bit at the moment. And what's your training like at the moment? I always like checking in with you on how you're always training quite relatively high frequency. And
I mean, I train 2 or 3 times a week, and I have done for a long time now. I still do my normal kind of like AB body weight routines. Actually, more recently, I've been doing sort of like 1.5 of those, just purely because of time. And you know, I seem to find myself falling from meeting to meeting most days. And this is the nice thing about working at home, though, is I can just jump in the garden and do that. But yeah, so I still do my at the moment. I if I have time, I do a kind of like fun Saturday workout, which is you know, I just play around with all the various bits of, you know, toys that I picked up for home workouts. One thing I've enjoyed recently is the one thing I've missed is not being able to occasionally jump in the gym and do some deadlifts. Just because I like doing deadlifts, I enjoy that exercise. I think it's a useful skill to be able to pick something heavy up and not injure yourself.
And the lumbar, right? The lumbar at the university.
I was thinking about that the other day, actually. Like I have missed training in that, but yeah. So I've been playing around with options to try and fit some deadlifts in and reasonably heavy deadlifts as well, because I've got dumbbells and I can do slow controlled, you know, dumbbell Romanian deadlifts, and you know, I can apply various different things to try and you know, pre-fatigue and increase the relative demands of those. But I got a couple of pretty heavy duty resistance bands from Decathlon, and at the base of my workout station, I put a few I put some clips in place, and I've got some adjustable dumbbell handles that are a nice solid kind of steel material, and they're thick, so they're like really robust. I tried doing it with my Easy Bar, and I bent it because the bands just bent the bar.
Wow.
So they get pretty heavy. But actually, one thing I have bought is I bought simply a deficit box, and it's just a little wooden box that has some holes, so I can feed the bands through it, loop them round, and then put the handles in it. And it's absolutely perfect for doing essentially like band trap bar deadlifts.
Nice.
And so that's been really nice. And I mean, I tried experimenting with the bands looped around the dumbbells, and I can't get a single rep out with the bands and the dumbbells. So I've got enough resistance to be working with.
Yeah, I've enjoyed watching you build that and use it on the Instagrams, and I highly recommend you follow James there, and we'll get his details at the end in a moment. You're quite handy, aren't you? Building things. Like I look at what you've done in your garden in terms of building the chin-up bar. Like I wouldn't know where to start. Like you would never find me doing that. I'd have someone over to do that for me. There's no way.
Super easy. I got a few posts, cut one in half, dug some holes, stuck them in, poured some cement, some post-cretin. It was a lot more ad hoc than you think. I did use a tape measure.
Was there a bit of YouTube involved, or do you just know what to do? That kind of thing.
No, well, I mean, it's a simple design, really. It didn't really require. I did have a little look just to see just to get some inspiration for what other people have put together. But some of the stuff on YouTube, it's like, oh man, like I'm not going to be like machining a whole thing. I'm going to get some fence posts that I can just, you know, cut in half. I've got to drill a hole, make sure I've got you know, sufficiently sturdy iron bars. Got some outdoor fence paint, metal fencing paint to weatherproof them, and yeah, sorted. That's needed. You should see my driving range that I've built.
Ooh, driving range in your garden? How big's your garden?
It's not that big, but I took up golf again last year. I used to be a very good golfer, but haven't played for about 15 years. And
very talented, so many skills.
I used to work at a golf
basketball, golf.
It's depressing how bad I am now, though. But I picked up some practice balls, some nice high quality ones, and and essentially all I've done is I've got a nice big cloth sheet and a retractable washing line, and so I put that across and whack the balls at it.
For some reason in my head, I thought, why is he just smashing golf balls out of his garden into like, other people's houses? And I was like, oh no, he means shooting into a sheet. I got it now.
I did panic the other day though, because I hit one. I accidentally got underneath one and it went over the sheet, and I went, oh my God. But these balls are, they'll I could smash it against the window and it would just bounce off.
Okay.
But they got a nice feel to them when you hit them.
So you didn't hear like anyone got the head cracked open on the news or anything?
No,
like that?
it didn't even make it out the garden. Like they're designed to not fly very far. So I was like I thought, oh no, I've lost one of them. That's like a £2 ball that's gone. I wonder how many of them are going to go.
Yeah. Okay, cool. James, final question for you. I want to let you go in a sec because I know you need to prepare for an important meeting. So this is just an observation, but one of the reasons why I love studies like this is because it kind of shows, well, look, if you're getting like a big push, a big pull, a leg press movement in your workouts, you're going to get pretty much most of the results, like 95% of the results. I hate putting a percentage on it, but it just makes it a bit clearer what I'm trying to say. And so, I'll do much more volume than that. But knowing I've done those movements a couple of times a week or even once a week is probably going to produce/hold on to whatever muscle I've been able to gain or strength I've been able to gain. I know we're more talking about strength here. And also just echoing James Fisher, your colleague on a podcast we did recently, where he said, he's doing twice a week, 12 exercises, but the way he orders his workout is he'll do like big free, he'll do large to small, but he'll start with like a big free in case he gets interrupted because he knows that's biggest bang for the buck. So is that a fair kind of mindset when it comes to training in terms of getting the most out of it?
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, that's exactly what I do. Like, if, for example, it's a day where I'm going to train, and I think I've said before, most of my bodyweight workouts, I'll do, 2 pushes, 2 pulls, lower body work exercise or whatever. If I'm running out of time, I'll just do a set of pull-ups, a set of push-ups, and a wall sit, and bish bash bosh done. If I've got the time to do the other exercises, it's great. I like doing it. I like spending 20 minutes as opposed to 10 minutes out doing a workout if I can. It's longer away from the desk, which is nice. But
and it maximizes the pump as well, which is more important.
Exactly. So I can come into my next Zoom call and sort of look a bit like thicker on the neck and get the traps going and do the casual kind of. I'll just have a little scratch there.
looking good, mate. Looking good. You've kept the diet in check. I can see.
I tell you what, I've put on 3 kilos over the last year.
Oh, yeah.
It's showing below the camera.
I'm like that. Yeah. Awesome, James. I want to be respectful of your time. Best way for people to find out more about you, sir. And maybe mention your Instagram and that kind of thing.
Yeah, probably follow me on Twitter, most science content and nonsense with the occasional tweets about how amazing the final season of Attack on Titan is. So yeah, Twitter is @JamesSteele II. Instagram, I think it's the same, or it might be James.Steele. I can't remember now. ResearchGate is probably the best place to follow for keeping up to date with any research we do, though. I keep that pretty up to date.
Awesome. Okay. And for everyone listening, to find the blog post for this episode, and if you want to find out 10 ways to generate more clients for your high intensity training business, please go to highintensitybusiness.com. You'll find the ebook for that in the sidebar, and search for episode 309 to get all the show notes of this episode, all the links that James mentioned. And until next time, thank you very much for listening.